we see through these laws that we're learning, these halachot that we're learning, and others, that isur, things that are prohibited, it's not just a law on the gavra, a law that governs the subject, governs the individual, that there's actually either a substance or an energy of isur. There's something physical that is prohibited. There's either a negative force or there's negative substance. And we see that, by the way, isur can contaminate heter, where something forbidden can actually contaminate something that is permissible. In the obvious cases, you've got a piece of treif meat, you cook it together with something kosher, it all becomes treif. There is contamination. There's something physical in the laws of kashrut. It's the taste, it's this. We know what the physical thing is that moves from one object to another. Sometimes the contamination is not physical. You can contaminate, one object can contaminate another object. In interesting cases, for example, in the laws of Tmura, you have hekdesh, you have something which has been dedicated to the Beit HaMikdash, therefore it's kodesh, and it is asur, you can't use it for personal use, and then you use Tmura, you try to transfer that kedusha from one animal to another animal, and what's the din is they both have the kedusha now. Now they're both forbidden. So it hasn't transferred, it's just, so to say, contaminated. You've passed the one to the other with no physical contact. You haven't cooked them in a pot. It's just an energetic force that has moved from one to incorporate the other. Sometimes it transfers from one to another. So in the case of pidyon bechor, when you want to transfer the value of a bechor onto money, we do that with meiser sheni. When we take meiser, and instead of taking the food to Yerushalayim, we transfer the kedusha of the food onto money, and we spend the money in Yerushalayim. And we learn that in the Torah. So those are situations where there's actually a movement from one thing to another thing. So we've got to, when we look at this, we've got to actually see this physical force that can move around or not. And where does Avodah Zarah fit? What is the power of Avodah Zarah? Is that a force that transfers? Is that a force that contaminates? That's part of what we'll be learning here on Daf Memtet Amud Beit, Transference and Contamination, Yוליך, הנאה, המלח. The Mishnah says, Natal mimena itzim, you chopped off branches from an ashera tree. Tree is absolutely forbidden. You've chopped off the broad, and asurim bano, you can't have benefit from these branches. Hesik bahene tatanur, if you now use the branches to heat an oven, im chadash yutzat vim yashan yutzan, so the oven's in trouble. You've either got to destroy the oven or wait for it to cool down. But the interesting one is afar bo et hapat. Now you've baked a loaf of bread in the oven which has been heated by the branches of an ashera tree. So now we're looking at how far this forbidden avodah zarah passes down. In this case, asura bahana, the loaf of bread can't be used. The loaf of bread now is asur. Nitzarva be'echirot. Now this loaf of bread gets mixed up. It's not just a private person who's using these Asherah trees, it's a massive bakery. And somehow the Asherah branches have been used to heat the furnace, and hundreds or thousands of loaves of bread are baked, and one of them, or some of them, were baked in the Asherah furnace, the rest of them were not. Rabbi Lozer Omer, Yוליך, הנאה, המלח. Rabbi Lozer says you can transfer the benefits. And now you don't know which bread it is, but you know that in this batch of loaves, there is some idolatry. So again, we've got to look through it through that lens of there's a negative energy, there's a negative object, there's something there that we're not allowed to have benefit from. What do? And bitul doesn't work. Just nullification doesn't work. So Rabbi Lozer has an interesting idea, and he says you calculate the value of the loaves of bread that are affected, or according to some, you calculate the value of the branches. But let's stay with the loaf of bread. So let's say there are 5 loaves of bread, and altogether that's $15 worth of avodah zarah. You take $15 and throw them into the Yam HaMelach, into the Dead Sea, where they'll be completely destroyed and nobody will be able to use them. And that way you've taken the value of avodah zarah, and you've destroyed the value of avodah zarah, although you haven't destroyed the actual object. There's still a loaf somewhere in there that was heated by the Asherah branches. That's still there. But you've taken the value out of this batch, and you've destroyed the value. Omrulo, the Chachamim say, ain't pidyon la'avodas kochavim. That doesn't work. Pidyon doesn't work with avodas kochavim. It's fine with Ma'aser Sheni. You can take your Ma'aser Sheni and put it onto money, and now you can spend the money in Yerushalayim, and you can eat the Ma'aser Sheni wherever you are. It doesn't matter because you've transferred it from one to the other. You can transfer Kedusha from a Bechor to money, that you can do. But you can't transfer Avodah Zarah from one thing to another thing. That doesn't work, says the Chachamim, which seems to be right. What is Rabbi Loza thinking? Not only that, but Omer Rabbi Chia Bered Rabbi Bar Nachmani Omer Rav Chisda Omer Zeiri Halacha Rabbi Loza. We paskin like Rabbi Loza that it does work, that you can take the value and destroy the value, and it all works. You remember I told you about Reb Zundel Kreuzer, who died only about 10 years ago. This wonderful tzaddik who lived in Yerushalayim in Nachlaot, you remember? Used to give a Daf Yomi shir in a shul in Nachlaot. Ilan was talking to Rav Licht about that shir, and Rav Licht said he knew him, he knew Reb Zundel well. So this is somebody in our generation, somebody that people know personally. His grandson, Baron Yaakov Kreuzer, has done a wonderful piece of work bringing to life the Tosfos of Rabbi Yehuda Mibir Noya. Rabbi Yehuda Mibir Noya is a Baal Tosfos. He was a Talmud of Ri, the great grandson of Rashi, the founder of the Tosfos movement. One of his Talmidim was Rabbi Yehuda Mibir Noya, and he wrote a Tosfos, which obviously is a lot of the ideas of his Rebbe, of Ri, which we haven't had until 10 years ago or so, when this person published the works of Rabbi Yehuda Mibir Noya, and he wrote this on Avodah Zarah. We have a Tosfos of Rabbi Yehuda Mibir Noya on Avodah Zarah. And he mentions that the Rashbam, that's the Ri's uncle, Posach Rabbeinu Shmuel B'Shem Rabbeinu Shlomo, the Rashbam in the name of Rashi paskind, that just as Rabbi Eliezer's trick works for Avodah Zarah, Hachanami Sharirin Kol Isuru Shebetorah Al Yadei Pidyon. You can do it with anything. If something's osur and it gets mixed up and you can't find where it is, you can put it on. So powerful is Rabbi Eliezer's view, which the Chachamim discount. Yet we not only do we paskin like Rabbi Eliezer, but Rashi and the Rashbam say this is a principle in all Isurim. Ve'ein nireh leRebbi. This does not appear right to my Rebbe, to the Ri. That doesn't work at all, because in the entire Talmud, Shebechol Talmud, the Ma'aseh Miltik Rabbi Eliezer, we don't find this being mentioned in any other Isurim. It's mentioned here. It's not mentioned with other Isurim. So the Ri doesn't accept this, but he doesn't explain why. The Tosfos in Zvochim are written by Rabbeinu Baruch. And Rabbeinu Baruch, Rabbi Yitzchak, was the Baal Truma, and the Baal Trumas, and he was also a Talmud of the Ri. So he brings this machlokas himself, he brings it, but he goes a step further. He gives us insight into the Ri's reasoning. Remember, I told you sometimes you've got to go to the Talmidim of the authorities to be able to understand the authorities. So the Ri says something, Rabbeinu Yehuda Mibir Noya brings it, but doesn't explain it. But Rabbeinu Baruch in the Tosfos on Zvachim does explain it. So have a look at the Tosfos in Zvachim. Tosfos asks, "Ma'ishna hacha diktani yidal kukish in tavu v'chein b'chol ha'isurim ha'shnuyim sham b'meseches orla." Then Zvachim, we're talking about a certain case where you have to destroy everything. There's no way of saving it by throwing money into the Dead Sea. There's nothing else to do. V'lo pligi Rabbi Eliezer. Why does Rabbi Eliezer not intervene here and say, no, there's a way to save it? But why does Rabbi Eliezer not come here and say, you can take the value, you can destroy the value? And we paskin halacha that way. Mi Rabbeinu Shmuel Pirisham Duhuadin B'chol Ha'isirim. Omer Rabbi Eliezer Yoli Chanol Yam HaMelech. The Rashbam says yes, although Rabbi Eliezer doesn't specifically say it, you can extrapolate from his halacha in our Mishnah to all Isurim in the Torah, and he holds there as well. He holds in every place. You can take the value, you can destroy the value, and that way you can dissipate the Isur, the prohibition, and it's destroyed from the world, and now everything's mutter. So here he brings the Rashbam. Venire, and he says, "The Rabbi Eliezer polig dafke gabi avedis kochavim." I believe, says the Tosfos, who is Rabbeinu Baruch, who's a Talmud of the Ri, says, I believe, like his Rebbe, that this is a specific, unique din by Avodah Zarah. It's only by idolatry that Rabbi Eliezer says you can do this. Why? He says a strange thing. Lefi shetofeset dameha ucheshimolich hanea liyam hamelach, because it gets infected with the Avodah Zarah. the money gets infected with the Avodah Zarah. If you transfer Avodah Zarah onto some money, onto some coins, the coins become asur. So there is a transference. And therefore, nireh ki'ilu molich ha'isur. It looks as if he's throwing the isur away. That's a strange thing. What do you mean it looks as if he's throwing the isur away? Why aren't you actually throwing the isur away? You're not actually throwing the isur away because the asur object still stays asur. So if you actually had the loaf of bread, the fact is the loaf of bread is mixed in a batch of loaves of bread. But if you had the loaf of bread in front of you and you said, I'm transferring the value of this Avodah Zarah loaf of bread, this prohibited idolatrous loaf of bread, I'm transferring its value onto this $10. Well, they're both also now. The $10 is also, and the bread is also. So it's not that it really transfers. But since the money has become osur as well, and now you're throwing the money into the ocean, it kind of looks as if you're destroying the Avodah Zarah. What's this looks like? It's so strange. So what the Ri is doing is the Ri is challenging the view of many Rishonim. You'll see on the next page the Ramban brings the Rashbam who says it applies everywhere, and he goes along with it. He agrees with the Rashbam that it applies everywhere. Many Rishonim agree with the Rashbam that it applies everywhere. The Ri says no. The Ri says what Rabbi Eliezer says is specific to the case of Avodah Zarah, and the reason is because there is this contamination. The money gets affected by the Avodah Zarah of the loaf of bread, even though the Avodah Zarah of the loaf of bread still stays there. But you can eat the loaf of bread because it's not visible. It's mixed up with all the other loaves of bread. There's a machlokas among the Rishonim whether it has to be mixed up, or even if the loaf of bread is sitting on your table, you know which it is. This is the one that was cooked in the Asherah oven. Even then, there are many Rishonim hold it's okay. You can still eat the loaf. You can still eat the loaf of bread. The Ran and the Balamor say no. It has to be mixed up. But many Rishonim say it isn't. And so we've got the Ri now. We've got a machlokas, Ri and Rashba. Firstly, we start with a machlokas, an argument in the Mishnah, where Rabbi Eliezer innovates this idea that you can take the value of the loaves of bread that were baked in the Avodah Zarah Dika oven, and you can discard the value, and now you can eat all the bread. We've got the Chachamim who say that doesn't work. You can't transfer Avodah Zarah from one thing to another. You've got, the Gemara says the halacha is like Rabbi Eliezer, and the Rashbam who says not only is the halacha like Rabbi Eliezer in Avodah Zarah, but it works for anything. If you've got a case of something which is also ba'anor, you're not allowed to get benefit from it, and got mixed up with a whole lot of other things, you can take the value, destroy the value, and now you can have benefit from the whole thing because you're actually not benefiting because you've destroyed the value. So you're not benefiting from the value. You're benefiting from the object, but you're not benefiting from the value. What is the reason for that? How does that work? So we don't know exactly, but we get more clarity in Rabbi Akiva Eiger. So now we come up to the late 18th century, early 19th century. Rabbi Akiva Eiger, one of the sharpest minds, if not the sharpest mind, of that period of very sharp minds. Rabbi Akiva Eiger is just this brilliant force of learning that we have. And it's very interesting that Rabbi Akiva Eiger, one of Rabbi Akiva Eiger's Talmudim was Reb Zundel Salanta. We always talk about Reb Zundel Salanta, usually at the Medrash here, as the connector between the Vilna Gaon and Rabbi Yisrael Salanta in the area of Musar. But Reb Zundel was also a Talmud of Rabbi Akiva Eiger. So one has to realize Reb Zundel was a huge Talmid Chacham in Lomdus, in learning, and that's really important to know that what gives a person authority, even in the area of philosophy and halakha and Musar, is how well he can learn in Lomdus. So Reb Zundel is a Talmud of Rabbi Akiva Eiger. Rabbi Yisrael Salanta, we know, was an unbelievable Talmid Chacham. He chose to specialize and to propagate his views of Musar, and that's what we know him as. And we know Reb Zundel as this tzaddik, and he propagated his ideas of Musar, and he developed Rabbi Yisrael Salanta. But we've got to realize these were also massive Talmidei Chachamim. And that's why it's important today. Every individual's got views and ideas about matters of hashkafa and matters of Musar, and what should be and what shouldn't be. And in Gemara, they're Amaratzim. If a person's an Amoritz in Gemara, he doesn't have the qualification in any Torah area. Gemara learning is the basic qualification to think in a Torah way, to understand things in a Torah way. Then you can apply that to Musar or to Kabbalah or to Midrashim or to philosophy, whatever you want. But if you don't have the basic skills, it's like trying to be a scientist without knowing math. It just doesn't work. So these people were very great, including Rabbi Akiva, who was one of the greatest of all. And Rabbi Akiva says the following. Yוליך, הנאה, המלח הוא רק בעבודה זרה. Reteaches us that this only works in avodah zarah, the tofes domov, where the value gets applied to the money. Asks Rabbi Akiva Avodah Zarah, lo paka isurei al yadei damav. How does it work, says Rabbi Akiva? At the end of the day, it's not as if the prohibition is removed from the first object. It isn't removed from the bread and put onto the money. We'll learn later on in the Masechta around Daf Nun Daled, I think we learned that they're both also. The bread is also and the money is also. It doesn't transfer, it just contaminates. So how does this work? That by throwing it into the Yam HaMelach, it works. So therefore the Rashbam should be right. Why is Avodah Zarah any easier than other Isurim? If the prohibition could be removed from the object and applied to the money in its stead, then I understand that in this case you throw the money into the Yam HaMelach. But it isn't. The Isur stays in the object. So why is this different from any other Isur? Answers Rabbi Akiva, this is a form of pidyon. So Rabbi Akiva says there are three categories. The category there's one category where you cannot extract the prohibition from an object, and you can't transfer it. It's there's nothing you can do. Then there's a category where you can transfer it. You can take the Isur from the object and apply it to something else, and now the object is no longer Asur. We have that in Shvius, we have that in Ma'aser Sheni, we have that in certain cases of Kodshim. And then we have a case where it contaminates the second object, but the first one remains also as well. In that second case, if you destroy, and here's the beautiful idea. So what are you doing now? You're destroying the money. But the Avodah Zarah is still in the world somewhere. In this batch of bread, there's a loaf of bread that was baked in this Asher Dika oven. That is there. And you've destroyed the Avodah Zarah. You've destroyed the money. What have you actually done? It's ki'ilu, he says it's as if, but what have you actually done? We see here there's an element that when you destroy Avodah Zarah, even if you haven't destroyed the object of Avodah Zarah, you've destroyed the value of Avodah Zarah. That destructiveness diminishes the Avodah Zarah in the world. It has a destructive effect. Even though if the object, according to the Rabbi Akiva, and we would hold the other Rishonim, we're learning, the Ri and others, if the loaf of bread was in front of us, you couldn't eat the loaf of bread. But since the loaf of bread is not visible, or Tosfos goes on in Zvachim and says it's not just that it isn't visible, the Avodah Zarah was the branches. The branches have been burnt a long time ago. The branches aren't there, the fire's not there, the oven's not there. It's a loaf of bread. It's distant from the original Avodah Zarah. And according to some Rishonim, it's mixed up in the whole thing. And what have you done? You've done an action of destruction of Avodah Zarah value. That's already enough. So that so much of this requirement that we destroy Avodah Zarah is not only to destroy objects of Avodah Zarah. It's not as if the object there's a force of Avodah Zarah in the world, and destroying it diminishes that force of Avodah Zarah. So in this case, since the actual original Avodah Zarah, the Asherah branches, are quite distant, and the loaf of bread itself is mixed up with 100 other loaves of bread, but there's still Avodah Zarah there, the bittul doesn't work, there's still Avodah Zarah there, by taking something else which has been infected by that Avodah Zarah and destroying the something else, in this case the money, that act of destruction of idolatry in itself is something positive. When you destroy something negative, you create positive. And that's part of the mitzvah of destroying Avodah Zarah. It's not just getting rid of the Avodah Zarah. By destroying negativity, we create positivity. And that's something we have to be aware of in our lives and even in what's going on with us at the moment, where there has to be so much distraction. And of course, the rest of the world just looks at the distraction, and that is, so when you destroy evil, you promote good. It's not as if you're just destroying evil and that's the end of it. No, the destruction of evil, even if you haven't got to the source and destroyed all the evil in the world, every time you destroy evil, if it's in yourself, you have an evil intention, and you destroy it. You put it aside. You've created something amazing. It's not just you've destroyed it. You've created something amazing. You destroy some Avodah Zarah. Yes, there's still Avodah Zarah in the world, but you've done an act of destruction. You've created something valuable. You've created something worthwhile. The destruction of negative energy is the creation of positive energy.